Okay, welcome back to Social Distillation, the submarine still of the internet, where we attempt to drop the bead and pour white lightning straight on your brain. And I wish I had some white lightning because Sam's going to make me talk about real stuff now, and I don't want to.
Yeah, this is part two. Part one was Wheel of Time book series stuff. If you're sticking around for both, thank you very much. Like, subscribe, and share it around. But now that we're talking about real things, there is no legal advice. There is no medical advice. There is no... I might give some training advice if we want to talk some training in this, because I'm allowed to do that. And because of the state of Texas rules, no nutritional advice if you suffer from any illness or disease. Covering my bases. Anything else we should disclaimer?
I hate what we're about to talk about, and it's going to make me want to hurt someone.
You don't even know everything we're going to talk about, because
I know what we're starting with, because I said, "What the hell is this?" And you said, "Oh yeah, that's been going on for a little while now."
Okay, so I'm gonna have a softer lead in.
Okay,
we're gonna talk about AIDS.
Okay,
so this generated from a client of mine. They get the headlines and everything. She goes, "My husband read an article that 13% of Americans are walking around with HIV without knowing it."
Oh dear Lord.
Yes. Okay, so
how old was this article? 1987? Seriously?
No, this was recent. And it's not the data that's wrong, it's the presentation of the data that's wrong. So it was written in a way where you got the impression that 13% of the population had HIV and didn't know it. For those that don't know anything about HIV, it's bad juju. You almost would know it unless you have a medical issue or you're so unhealthy that everything is wrong with you. So where did the numbers come from? Well, I had to look these up for her to alleviate her, I guess, kind of fear is probably the best word. So I looked up the actual data. 1.2 million people in the US have HIV. About 13% of the 1.2 million don't know it. That's the estimates. And we've got the same thing from the CDC, pretty much the same numbers, about 13%. So the article was written in a way that give you the impression that 13% of Americans, but no, it's 13% of Americans that have HIV don't know it, which comes out to about 0.04% of the population.
Yeah. So, well, which makes sense, because so here's a weird analogy, but it's like unemployment. Oh, stay with me here. So economists consider, I want to say, like 3 or 4% unemployment to be full employment. It's somewhere in that range. It's 3-ish plus or minus 1%, something like that, because you're always going to have people in transition, right? So you're always going to have, people moving from one job to another or whatever. And so there's always going to be that transition period. There's always going to be that group of people.
Mm-hmm.
If you contract
there's
HIV,
also going to be a group of people that really aren't employable.
Mm-hmm.
And
so so you can never have 0% unemployment is the point. Okay. Well, you're always going to have some percentage of people with any disease that does not show symptoms quickly that are walking around not knowing they have it.
Yeah. Or this is a point Joe Rogan brings up when he has health experts on, is we have so many unhealthy habits as Americans that sometimes it's hard to tell when disease is actually present, because you have symptoms of disease from your unhealthy habits. Like, well, I drink too much sometimes and I wake up with a headache. Do I have XYZ headache causing disease, or did I just drink too much last night? Sometimes it's hard to tell, right? And so when you talk about something chronic, especially an immunodeficiency like HIV, do I have autoimmune disease? Do I have HIV? Do I just drink too much so my liver's fighting back at me? And you see it.
What are the two biggest spreaders of HIV? Butt sex and intravenous drug use. Okay. Well, a lot
But
of
shared
people,
needles specifically. Yeah.
yeah, specifically.
Yeah.
So a lot of people who are using unclean needles to pass around intravenous drugs are
Also on
very
those drugs all the time.
very poor or even homeless.
Hmm.
And so they either don't have the access to the testing or they don't care because they're so strung out on drugs, they don't care about anything.
Hmm.
So there's always going to be a percentage there who don't know.
So if you're in the dating world, it's not, you know, more than 1 out of 10 people you're dating could possibly have HIV. It is a little more than 1 out of 10 of people who have it just don't know it. And it's
Yep.
probably pocketed in communities that have heavy drug use. And
Do you have the scare article that
no, I was looking
caused
for
this?
it. I was looking for it and I asked her to send it to me, but I haven't got an answer back
Okay.
yet. Yeah, I
'Cause I'm
really wanted that.
I'm curious how it was written, which is utter nonsense. I think it was.
I
This has
found
been
some
going.
that could have been similar, but I don't think they still. I thought they were clear enough, but it might have been just clear enough to me because I look at data all day.
This was going on for a while. I think I've ranted about this before on the podcast here that um the fear of the spread of HIV into the heterosexual community or into the population at large. This is I showed the clip of I either showed the clip or shared the article talking about Fauci doing some of the scaremongering himself during the early mid 80s. I think it was like 1990. Oprah had a big show on AIDS. There was a whole episode on AIDS, and she had some experts on there saying that within within a certain number X number of years, some absurd Y number of heterosexuals were going to be infected with HIV. It never happened.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, since we got kind of an understanding of how HIV spreads, the numbers have been pretty static for decades now. The percentage of the population that is infected with HIV has been pretty static, and the number of well, let's beat around the bush a little bit here. The population where HIV is prevalent has overwhelmingly been within a certain group of behaviors, shall we say.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of crossover between that group of behaviors and the general population at large, which is why it has mostly stayed within the population who perform these
and
behaviors.
I would say we probably could do a Venn diagram on this too.
Yes.
Where the crossover of the two most common populations is where the biggest collection is going to be.
Yes.
The people that do both.
And there were stories, and people will say, yeah, well, what about, yeah, okay, that's why I said mostly, that's why I said overwhelmingly. That's there were always anecdotal stories because they're heart-wrenching or because people were trying to scaremonger of, a blood transfusion. I remember one of the early kids that died of AIDS. It was because he got a blood transfusion with blood that was infected with HIV. I remember a story.
Test for now. We have a cure for that. It's called testing.
I remember a story about a nurse who filed a mega lawsuit against the hospital and the city because they had brought in a prisoner for treatment and he was HIV positive. So nobody wanted to get close to him. So the police weren't helping restrain him. And in his thrashing around, the IV needle came out and got stuck in this nurse.
Yeah.
And it infected her. So yeah, bizarre situations like that do happen, but not often.
I just wanted to kind of bring that in as a soft opening to what we're going to talk about here in a little bit, because I think the important point I want to bring from that is when you read something in a news article, you have to ask the question to yourself, is this designed to get a limbic response, or a cognitive response. And that article was written in a way that she probably didn't get the words in between that made it clear that it was 13% of this other percent. Just like the articles we talked about before, eating bacon raises your chance of having colon cancer by 3%. Well, that's 3% of your original chance of having colon cancer. So if that's 1%, then you now have 1.03% chance of having that. It's a lot less daunting. But somebody that wants to push a vegan agenda or something writes this article that is supposed to say, wow, shoot, that's 3 out of 100 a chance I'm going to get colon cancer now if I eat bacon. And it does it raise it every time I eat it? Or, you know, so it's, does this article want a limbic response or a cognitive response? The answer is yes. Every news article wants a limbic response. I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. They want that limbic response because that's what sells papers or subscriptions or tickets to the show. So I think that's one reason why, you know, people like us have trouble breaking through, is because we try to do everything from a cognitive standpoint. Which, you know, some people get, and we appreciate you guys. Share us, please. But at the same time, it's not that initial hit. Even people I do follow, like Viva Fry out of Canada. He's a lawyer up there, and he's been he's been doing his show for a while. His little short shows are in your face and loud, and going out there. And even if you agree with the premise, you're like, you're getting you're a showman. You know, you're trying to get this cognitive response. Doesn't take away from his expertise, but the thing is designed to get that limbic response, even if he's right or wrong. And so that's the first question you need to ask when you read something in the news or in media of any kind, social media or print media. That was designed to get the limbic response of, oh my God, AIDS is everywhere. And I don't know what the agenda was. I have a bad feeling we're going to bring AIDS back into the mix of the pandemic stuff. But again, I need to get a hold of the actual article. But so going forward, what we talked about last time, and we wanted to bring up, you brought up the British Journal of Medicine being fact checked by Facebook, right? So, of course, I have to bring that up. Here we go. Here's Facebook versus BMJ when fact checking goes wrong. So, British Journal of Medicine has been writing, as medical journals do, about COVID stuff because it's what it does. It's important. It is the British Journal of Medicine. And so it released some papers, and Facebook put a little disclaimer on them as misinformation, missing context. Well, there was nothing incorrect in the articles because it's the actual authority on the research, and they were doing the research that is being checked. And so this is an interesting story because I think it brings to light something we've been complaining about this whole time. This isn't some guest on Rogan. This isn't some pundit on Fox News or something. This is an actual medical journal conducting research. And to say their research is wrong because Facebook says so, because the authorities say differently, is not only irresponsible but dangerous, because they're the ones that you should be getting your information from. We don't say these are the experts. This is actual research, and I'm reading the research, and you're saying it's false, even though I've got the methods, I've got the data, I've got everything in front of me. And I think this is a huge deal. And I'm going to bring up some stuff later. I'm going to get your opinion here, but I'm going to bring up some stuff after that makes it even doubly important.
There's a lot to unpack here. And I mean, one of my first thoughts is, because you're talking about the authority of what they're fact checking. If this is a medical journal, and keep in mind that we have been told repeatedly throughout this pandemic, if you try and bring up a point counter to the official narrative of, well, where are your studies? Where's your research? Where's your
follow the science?
Okay, except how many times do we have to show you examples of where research, the journals that you're telling me to show you, are being suppressed? Last time we talked about COVID, we talked about the person who was recorded admitting that he modified his findings to be more in line with what the Gates Foundation vaccine people wanted it to say. Okay. We very early on, we brought up that study from that small study from, I think it was done in McKinney here. And it was a small study. It admitted this is a small study with a small sample size. It suggests this, so we should do further research. And then it just disappeared and nothing came from it. And here again, you have an authoritative source and the fact checkers are saying, no, this is misinformation. Based on nothing, based on it, and by their own admission, but the fact checkers, by their own admission, they aren't checking facts. They're checking the narrative.
Well, and this is part of the whole issue that was brought forward when the highest court in the land determined that fact checks were opinion. And so we've got a reputable medical journal releasing data and statistics and double-blind studies and progressive or prospective studies and all of these things. And the information in those studies is called misinformation. Here's why it's doubly important. I'm going to take you to another website. And this is not a fringe newspaper or anything. This is Department of Homeland Security. Summary of terrorism threat to the U.S. homeland. To be included as terrorism is mis, dis, and malinformation, which we will get defined. Misinformation is incorrect information that it's just incorrect information. Disinformation is incorrect information used to incite violence. Malinformation is correct information that can lead to dissent from the population against the government. Correct information that can lead to dissent.
Well, better confiscate all the copies of the Declaration of Independence. Better confiscate all the copies of the Quran. Better confiscate all the copies of the Bible. Why not? If we're going to buy into this idea, that's what you're talking about. This isn't slippery slope either. That's what you're talking about.
Again, I mean, yeah, like I said, this is not a news article about something. This is Department of Homeland Security statement.
We have slipped the slope already, people.
This statement expires in June, which they'll possibly just renew it, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, they have defined giving correct information that they deem unfortunate for their agenda as terrorist action.
So the British Medical Journal publishes an article, and we can't even talk about what it was talking about, or we'll get banned for violating guidelines. I don't know if anyone's noticed that, but we haven't actually mentioned what the kerfuffle was all about, because the subject matter of that article,
a certain company was fudging data
egregiously
in order to get certain approvals.
And there was a whistleblower who wasn't just talking. There was a whistleblower who wasn't just making claims. She brought receipts. She had documentation. The documents have since been released publicly. So what this whistleblower was saying is all verifiable.
Yeah. And a lot of people are injecting their kids with this, but
yep.
Uh,
the other thing to unpack here that I was it was
this
just
one may
driving me
end up
crazy
only
about
on
this.
Rumble. So
Yeah.
if you get to hear this on YouTube, we will back it up on Rumble. And I think we beat around the bush enough, though. We
the
might get out
whole
of it.
idea of missing context is just absurd in this situation. And here's why. So one of the most annoying things to have to deal with in history, in the field of history, is, well, why did you leave this out? Why didn't you mention this? Okay, well, because history is really big. All right. You can't talk about everything. So it can be applicable in something like history where there is context to everything. But when we would present and discuss our papers in grad school, one of the things we tried to do as much as possible is not talk about the things you left out. Okay, unless it was something kind of
unless it was
big or glaring.
Yeah, unless it was really important.
Right. So okay, I'm presenting a paper talking about the intelligence data leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor. Okay. Well, why didn't you talk about the America First Society? Because I'm not talking about the politics leading up to Pearl Harbor. I'm talking about the intelligence leading up to Pearl Harbor. So you could claim that I'm missing context because I haven't talked about that. That's not the scope of my analysis here.
And that's the part of the quote unquote fact checkers system is they always have something to put the label on you. And again, as we talked about with our misinformation episode, it's almost like a badge of honor now. It's almost like, please don't look there because they have something to say.
Yeah. So if I'm presenting using my analogy of real life example, I'm presenting something about the pre Pearl Harbor intelligence. Let's say I'm only using one source, or I'm completely ignoring one source. Let's use that instead. So I'm showing you, so here's some FBI memos, here's the magic intercepts. Okay, well, it would be legitimate to say, how come you didn't bring up any of the Office of Naval Intelligence documentation? Because here's all this documentation, and some of it runs counter. So that is a legitimate, hey, missing context, because you're purposefully leaving out something within the scope of your analysis which contradicts what you're saying. So as you've talked about in scientific studies, if you have something like that, in the same way with something in the humanities, I would need to bring that up. I would need to say, here's what these people were saying that contradicts this. Here's why I think it isn't persuasive, right? They didn't do that with this missing context with the British Medical Journal. It was completely outside of the scope of what the article they were fact checking was all about. It was not a fact check. It was a rebuttal. It was a editorial rebuttal. It was saying that all of that which you said is factually accurate, but.
Well, and this might be taking it kind of too deep in the weeds, but the missing context when it comes to the things we've been dealing with the in respect to the BMJ article, the disease that has plagued the world, a lot of that is based on mathematical models from certain organizations. And whenever you have models, you have assumptions. And you can always make an assumption that gives you the conclusion you want. And so when they're making these claims, they're like, well, it doesn't, yeah, your research said this, but you're not 100% factual because this other thing could happen. And that's been our the real plague in all of this is we've been running more on the models than we have on what's actually right there in front of us, or what we already know from past viruses and stuff. So it's really been kind of this circular process of, well, we just made another model to fit our paradigm that we wanted. Uh, that gets us on the topic of narrative. And what I was looking for earlier, if you see me a little bit distracted and I couldn't get it, I thought I had it in my bookmarks, but I didn't, I guess, is that MIT article that the MIT paper that said, yes, we're getting two different conclusions from the same data, but one has the proper narrative. And that narrative should be social justice oriented and should be, oh, that's what I wanted to bring up. Damn it. Do I have it on my computer? That Atlantic article. I showed you the headline and I said, is this where you wanted me to go with the talk?
Oh, geez. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to get
talk and fill some space while I look this article up.
Well, what I don't know. I think I've already blown my load on this thing without getting into the specifics of what the article was talking about. Well, I will plug another channel, because where I found this was I've mentioned a channel called China Uncensored, which focuses on China news. They have another show called America Uncovered, which is one of the best news channels I found, because they're actually they're pretty middle of the road.
Here's the difference between facts and narrative.
Oh, geez.
This is in the Atlantic. It's not a fringe newspaper. It is a nationwide newspaper. Mask mandates are illogical. So what? They only need to align with community's goals. Here's the original headline. Mask mandates don't need to make sense. They just need to align with community goals. Whose community goals?
Follow the science.
Someone like Trudeau? Should we go down that road? Gosh.
No, I mean that. Yeah, sure. Let's.
What is the community goal that you're talking about when they don't work? What's the community goal? Health? No. Control? I think we're warmer on that one.
Yeah, they're admitting what we've been hinting at and then outright saying, as we have been allowed to talk more openly about some things, is if this isn't about health, what's it about? And they're admitting, kind of like in the Time article of fortifying the election, you're freaking admitting what you're calling conspiracy theory. You're admitting what you are calling conspiracy. You're admitting that it's not about health. Okay.
Yeah, in that article, they basically said, we legally rigged something. That's all they did. And everything that's actually true. Everything was perfectly legal there. There was no F word. It was all legal.
Yeah. And in this Atlantic article, they're putting to the lie to what is being said now that so Rogan mentioned this in one of his misinformation rebuttals when the Spotify poop started to hit the fan. He mentioned a number of examples of, well, here's the problem with misinformation. What's misinformation now? Throughout this whole pandemic, what was misinformation now, 6 months down the road, is widely accepted as truth. And he mentioned a bunch of examples. So, and you have a bunch of people now talking about from COVID versus with COVID, masks versus no masks, this, that. And there's a whole bunch of experts now saying, well, the science has changed and we have to follow the science. No, it hasn't. You've changed. The narrative has changed.
About Rogan, because I think we need to get ahead of something, because he just recently had Coleman Hughes on. And I can see how somebody from the outside looking in from the other side of the aisle will make a conclusion that I could bring forward here. But I would like people to understand that if you're on Rogan, you're scheduled half a year in advance. So, all of the controversy happened in between Coleman being scheduled and him being on by a long shot. Because you're scheduled way out in advance
because he's a big effing deal.
But I think what came across to me the first half, and I have to listen to the second half, but what came across was it almost seemed like Rogan brought on the black guy to talk about the N-word and how he didn't do wrong, which was part of the conversation. And it almost seemed like it was planned to be that way. But again, you're not on Rogan unless you're scheduled six months to a year in advance.
Yeah.
He's that in demand, really. And so I think that that's important to know going into that. Otherwise, from the outside looking in, it kind of looks like we're just trying to do damage control here, and we picked the black guy that agrees with me, you know.
Right.
But how bad are those dogs coming through?
Yeah, they're pretty loud, but I
Okay.
can still hear you.
But Tim Pool actually had a really good analogy on the use of language that I think I'm going to repeat it because so give him the credit for this. I don't know where he got it from, unless he made it up on his own. But he said, imagine being at a spelling bee, and so you're at the spelling bee, and so pretend you're the person that has to go up and spell it. Your word is there. What would you ask me?
Use it in a sentence.
Sam said your word is there. Spell it. Exactly. Context does matter.
Yeah.
That word has no meaning until I actually use it in context. And so he was repeating a book title or quoting somebody who said something that had that word in it.
Yeah.
Context does matter when it comes to words. And that was like the best analogy I'd ever seen, the spelling bee analogy. So give Poole the credit, steal it from here. I don't care. But yeah, that was very quickly profound.
Speaking of context, back to my rant.
Okay.
The context of all these experts now saying the science has changed. Okay, let's put in the context of what's happened in the last 2 years. That there were. So you remember some of the first people to get banned were a couple of doctors from LA real early on. This was like March.
The frontline?
Yeah, no, these weren't the frontline people.
Okay.
They weren't. I think they later became affiliated with some people, but at first they were just where I think they were both ER doctors. Where we've treated, hundreds of patients. I don't remember the exact number. We've treated hundreds of patients, and this is what we're seeing. This is what we're seeing, and this is what we're doing. And it was running counter to. Remember, the narrative at the time was that Imperial College of London's study that, to your earlier point, was all based on modeling.
Mm-hmm.
And they were saying, look, we're not seeing what your models are predicting. That's not what's happening on the ground. And YouTube yanked them. That they had a kind of a press conference. It was up on YouTube. And it was yanked. Anyone who tried to share it, that their video was yanked. So they were some of the first people. And so the science didn't change. The political science changed, is my point.
Yeah. Well, anytime you're dealing with mathematical models, by no means is this anti-mathematical model, because we depend on them in so many ways. But this goes across the spectrum of all things we talk about. It could be disease, it could be climate change, it could be sexual assault prevalence, it could be anything. The thing you need to know about mathematical models is there's always an assumption if you're predicting the future, and we call the assumptions the bodies. Where are the bodies buried? Uh-huh. For instance, we brought up one probably in a single digits episode of domestic violence. Every 9 seconds, someone is a victim of domestic violence. Well, the assumption there is how many are unreported. And so you have to make a prediction there to determine that predicted number, because every 9 seconds is a lot.
Yeah.
It's like three something million occurrences in a year. Well, the actual number is about 100,000. So the assumption is how many are unreported. Well, you're a couple million off.
Yeah.
And so when we look at assumptions about COVID or anything, where are the bodies buried? What is the assumption they're making along the way? And it's not always clear. I gave you a kind of a clear example, but when we talk about an airborne virus, there's very little clarity because it's an airborne virus, which I wish people would get through their head. By the way, we're not done with this. It has animal reservoirs. It's aerosol. As soon as we knew it was aerosol, we should have already said cloth masks don't work, which was what,
Well,
April of 2020.
and again, let's focus on the masks because that's what we're talking about with the Atlantic article here. Is the science has not changed. The official narrative has changed. The people giving the official narrative has changed. And the mask is a really good one because it's flip-flop this whole time. Now they're saying, okay, well, yes, now it's official, they don't work. But again, Fauci was saying they don't work back at the very beginning. And then it was, okay, well, now you need to wear 2 or 3 masks. What the heck? And we talked about, here are studies, here are meta studies of all of the studies that show efficacy of masks are in surgical or hospital situations. There are no studies or the studies that do show general population use like this are either inconclusive, show nothing, or show a negative result, actually,
or poorly designed.
I
don't know how many poorly designed studies I've read in this whole process, and it's blowing me away. I mean, this is stuff that wouldn't pass 7th grade science fair kind of stuff, and policy is being made on it, or internet arguments are coming out of it. When I was doing the analysis of the meta that your friend brought forward, they, for one, out of 160 studies, they included 10 for their criteria, and then they basically excluded 8 of them by adding a bias score to them. But even reading the individual studies, I was like, who put this together? I mean, I remember designing studies in grad school and in even undergrad, and I would have got a C at best on some of those. And I'm like, this is crap work, and it's being put out there. So it's almost like there's an agenda. I don't know.
Almost like, here's what it is. They're admitting it now. It's not about health. It's about community goals.
But no,
what's your goal?
But the counter to that too, though, is the crap studies are on the other side as well. There's so many IVM studies that were just so poorly designed that you're like, you can't even get a conclusion from this. What's even your goal? Now, we do have one that is, we talked about British Journal of Medicine, and so this is one of the first things that came into my mind. It was, there is a study going on in Oxford right now that is very well designed on that certain pharmaceutical that is not to be discussed. And the media,
the Queen might be taking.
Yeah. And the media is actually getting ahead of it and talking trash about the study itself before it's ever even released. Like, they ran out of the pharmaceutical and all these false stories that have come out. And here's the news cycle right now. False story, redaction, nobody reads. That's the way it's been going. But they've actually been getting ahead of this, and we're actually going to get the best long-term double-blind, thousands of participants study on this one thing that's been controversial for a long time. And some people have already read stories that it's a crap study. I'm like, this thing is well designed, and it's not done yet.
The vehemence with which they are targeting this one particular thing, to me, shows you that it's not about science, because it's about something else. Otherwise, they wouldn't be so unhinged about this one thing.
And it blows me away because it doesn't matter. The numbers don't change. That's to their advantage. Even if you include this one thing, you still have that many people getting sick. You still have a large number of people dying. You still have all of these things. And it is blowing me away why this thing is so controversial.
Well, here's from the top. I don't know why the media is so bought into this, which as is, I brought up the, oh crap, what was that?
Well, finish your thought and then remind me to take it back to masks on that. So,
well, okay, so I don't know why the media is so bought into this, but the people at the top who are pushing the narrative, the top experts, I think they're so invested in it because they from the beginning have been trying to hide what is going on. It's the, you got to be careful when you're telling a lie, because then you have to tell a lie about the lie, and then you have to tell a lie about the lie about the lie, and then
mhm.
the more that has come out, and I've shared some of this data, that it wasn't just that there was a leak in a lab in Wuhan. That's just part one. That's just the surface of what is now being admitted.
Okay, so you brought up
We
those papers.
funded it.
Yeah, not only did we fund it, but when you brought up those papers, we knew the curative process at that time. And that, okay, so that's the lie about the lie about the lie, where this one thing comes in. Now masks, on the other hand, it makes more sense because it's a very visual sign. It's the us versus them.
Mhm.
You can walk down the street and see who's a them by whether they're wearing a mask or not, depending on which side of the aisle you're on. So it becomes a status symbol. I'm one of the good guys because I'm wearing the mask, or I'm one of the good guys because I'm not wearing a mask.
It is, we have finally reached full idiocracy, because we have now reached physical, tangible virtue signaling. People have been talking, complaining about virtue signaling for a while now, and it's stuff you say. It's what you say online and how you present yourself. And now we actually have scarlet letters. We actually have, colored hats, whatever you want to say. We have.
Can I put tinfoil hat on for a little bit?
Do it. Listen to the crazy voices.
Okay, so I put this in my post because I was behind on posting our videos, and I posted the one where we talked about young men, but also shame, guilt, and compassion and empathy differences. And I put a little blurb on there too, because there's something that we'd been kind of noticing and we've touched on before, but we've never really talked about, is the treat yourself movement. The online social media self-care movement is exactly how you raise a narcissistic child. And I think, as much as big tech has had to do with our political process and basically going into this oligarchy that we have, I think that's on purpose, because that changes the shame guilt dynamic. Because what do narcissists not ever feel? Guilt, because guilt has self-responsibility. But they are very susceptible to other people's opinions about them. And I'm just along the way, not just social media, but even regular media. The only time I see commercials is watching football, but one I kept seeing coming up was this kid putting his phone on his handlebars of his bike, and the song in the background is "I Look Good Today." And he's going around town having people watch him ride his bike and then looking at the likes as they come through on his feed. And I'm like, what are we teaching kids these days? Does he have any self-worth of his own? Or is it 100% dependent on those likes? And I almost think that it's purposeful movement to create a generation of people that are 100% shame based, because that's how you get China 2.0. And text right in there. Well, shoot, look at freaking Zuckerberg himself. He's trying to create more of him because he's freaking Data from Star Trek. Did I get you researching something?
Yeah.
Well, I'll give you a second to look that up because I'm going to go pee, and I'll be right back.
So what I was looking for is because you talked about the lack of empathy, and the first thing I thought of was the study that has been talked about the NIH funding some really grotesque experiments. And they didn't perform the experiments. No, but you funded it, and it was funded in a lab in Tunisia so that it wouldn't be done here. And the most egregious and horrific parts of the experiments is that these beagles had their vocal cords cut so that they would not, stress out the researchers, because they were put in cages that locked their heads into nets full of a particular type of parasitic flea, and they were eaten alive for part of this experiment. I don't know what the hell they were studying, but that's a pretty damn horrific study. And that was just the worst. In this, when this first came out, there were several pretty grotesque studies that were funded by the NIH, and this was just the most salacious one.
Yeah.
And
as I highlighted as you were talking, that's $500,000.
Mhm.
That's a lot of money to study flies eating dogs for whatever reason.
There is a serious lack of empathy to do something like that. And I was having trouble finding the articles, because this is actually like half a year old, I think. It's about six months or more when this first came out. I think Washington Post was the one that first broke the story. And one of the reasons I was having trouble finding it is because when I went looking, looky, the first things to pop up were
the
fact check.
checks. Yeah.
Were various fact checkers.
And so for everyone out there, this, let me bring it back up. This is MSN.
Mhm.
So this is right there up in the top. Whoops. But if I go back to my search, the first things that pop up is factcheck.org, PolitiFact.
Mhm.
Yep. And the thing they bring up is missing context. And the in the article of missing context is Fauci didn't do the research himself.
Yeah.
It was, so the fact you're missing is he didn't do it himself. Well, of course, he's on freaking CNN every day. He can't do the research himself.
And no one was alleging it. They were, the articles pointed out this research was done at a lab in Tunisia. So clearly it wasn't the NIH directly. It wasn't Fauci directly. No one was alleging that. You're using this idea of missing context to do misinformation your own, because when you talk about this missing context, this misinformation, every time they do this that I've seen, they start creating scarecrows to imply or outright say that this person said this when they did no such thing.
Well, here's a great example with Fauci is go back to his arguments with Rand Paul. Listen to his answers when Paul would ask him about gain of function research. His answer was always, I did not create COVID-19. No one ever alleged that. That has yet to be alleged at all. They asked if he did gain of function, and he would answer with, I did not create the disease we're dealing with right now. Factually, both were correct, but you could still fact check and say he didn't create that. And
yeah,
it's, wake up, people. Read between the lines for just 1 second. And
you've got an organization here with a disturbing empathy problem. Was the point of bringing up the Beagle studies?
Well, this is where empathy and compassion align too, though, because to have universal compassion, you would never want to do that to any living being to begin with. But then to be there and see it happening and not do something about it, that's where you also have a lack of empathy. And I mean, we can go down the road of sociopaths in power, which is unfortunately very prevalent. But
and the idea that they didn't know, that they just funded it, I will, because that is something that is also brought up when I brought up that that leaked memo from the Marine major who worked at DARPA and now works at another agency. They said exactly what they were doing. When you give a grant proposal, you give your methodology. So the idea of infecting wild bats with this mRNA thing, go back and watch that episode so I don't have to rehash it. They laid out their methodology, and that's why it was rejected by DARPA. They said, hold on a second, this methodology is dangerous. It can lead to problems, and it's a violation of the, at the time, moratorium on gain of function research. And then they went to NIH, and NIH funded it. The point being, they knew exactly what they were funding. You can't say, well, they fund all kinds of things. Yes. And when a grant is approved, you know their methodology, because that's part of the grant proposal.
And this is something I can speak to from experience, because the process to getting the funding and the resources you need to do a research project is pretty extensive. So my research proposal when I was in grad school was fitness based, and I wanted to compare standard hypertrophy training, which is muscle building, your standard bodybuilding, to a technique called complex training, where you're pairing a strength exercise with a dynamic plyometric exercise. And we know from the literature that the complex training actually leads to a greater nervous system reaction. But what was unclear was what was the muscle building kind of benefit from it. Is it the same? Is it less? Because if it's less, then you want to spend time doing the other thing to build up the muscle and basically build the body you're going to put through the other training. And what I was noticing from just case study with clientele was they seem to get a great benefit from the other with in the muscle building. So I did I had to write a proposal for it. And you would start with a short-term study versus a long-term study. And when you do a short-term study, you need blood markers. So when you damage muscle, creatine kinase is a chemical that's inside the muscle, and it's not in your bloodstream. So when you damage muscle, that would be in your bloodstream as well. And so you can do kind of an analysis of how much muscle damage you did by how much of that is in your bloodstream. And so you would get a number of participants in. I think we settled on 18 in each branch to get a statistical significance. And you would have them do the regular workout, take the blood. Then you would have them do the complex training. Then you would take the blood, and then you would have a control group that was just random people. And in order to draw blood to measure the creatine kinase, you needed a shit ton of approvals to get it through. And that's what stopped my research. They were like, oh, we want to do this other project that doesn't involve blood draws, because you need to go through this whole dadgum process that we're too small of a school to get. So it takes a lot to get approval just to draw someone's blood to take a biological marker. And the fact that they're just basically killing animals to do something lets you know all the red tape they had to go through in that process. So a lot of people at a lot of different levels approved this. And then the funding came from the people we were talking about. So that's my own personal experience on how hard this process is and the crap that's going on within that process. We probably ought to call it there.
Well, I'm depressed now. I hope everyone else is too.
Oh, I'm not depressed. I'm angry.
Yeah.
It's bastardization of the process that I've been, living for so long, which I guess is what sparked this whole podcast thing, because I was so pissed off. So.
All right. Well, hopefully we'll have something cheery to talk about.
Well, we got a Wheel of Time stuff.
But I doubt it, because after we talk about Wheel of Time, we'll probably have to talk about World War III.
Oh God. Yeah, that happened last night. That started.
Mhm. I'm sure it's fine.
Oh, well, we got possible civil war north of us,
Yeah,
and
they're certainly trying to prompt it.
and the National Guard is already called to stop the truckers going to DC. So
Oh, I didn't hear that yet. So that's
yeah,
delightful.
all it takes is one idiot at this point. So, which is probably an FBI plant.
Which, you know, it's almost like that's what they want.
Almost like it's what they want.
Yeah. Isn't it curious that they won't answer those questions about January 6th? All right, I'm gonna go make myself a lot of tinfoil hats, and I'll talk to you later.
All right, later. We'll back this up on Rumble, people.
Yeah.